I do if I don't agree with the assessment outcome?
Well, that will largely depend on what assessment has been undertaken. There are two separate assessments for the process of continuing healthcare funding. The checklist assessment and the decision support tool assessment. The checklist being the first upon which it will trigger if somebody requires a second full decision support tool assessment. So dealing first with the checklist. If you don't agree with the outcome of a checklist, which would be the case that they're saying it doesn't trigger for a full assessment, for example, you do have a number of options, but the main key difference is that you cannot appeal the outcome of a checklist assessment in the same manner that you can independently appeal an outcome of a decision support tool assessment that you disagree with. So the options are really to ask for a new checklist to be undertaken if you disagree with the outcome that's occurred. You would have to obviously justify the rationale for needing a new checklist to be undertaken, and the main reason that this often occurs is that the process itself was incorrectly conducted. So, for example, the patient and or their representative or family member are entitled to be playing a full part in a checklist assessment. So, if a checklist has been done in the absence of the patient or their family, and you're simply given a negative outcome, you clearly have a basis to be able to say that you disagree with the process that's been conducted, and you would request a second checklist be undertaken which you can fully partake in. Secondly, if it's the case that the scorings, if you like, for a checklist grossly do not reflect the evidential position as to what the patient's health needs and social needs are, then clearly you have an argument to be able to go back to the clinical commissioning group and say that the checklist that has been undertaken doesn't marry up with the evidential position of what the patient's needs are, and as such the only appropriate outcome would be for a second checklist assessment to be undertaken to reflect the evidential position. Now, it's not strictly necessary for a checklist to be passed or to trigger a full DST. There are certain circumstances, such as we've just outlined, where you can simply ask the clinical commissioning group to proceed to a full decision support tool assessment undertaken by a multidisciplinary team. One reason for doing so would be that you could say that it's simply the case that the positions of the two parties, i.e. the patient and or their representatives and the clinical commissioning group, are so widely different that the only reasonable thing to do would be for matters to be considered at a full multidisciplinary decision support tool assessment. That is laid out within the national framework as an option available to a clinical commissioning group. However, they may be reluctant to do so because, of course, there will be people that simply do not trigger a checklist assessment for a full decision support tool assessment, and clearly, from their perspective, understandably, they don't want to be redoing checklists that correctly have gauged the needs or lack of needs of the patient. So what I'm trying to get across is that there are a number of options available, but clearly none of which are particularly straightforward, and all of which I would suggest support the need and benefit of having an expert in your corner, such as Compass CHC, to be able to take these arguments forward on your behalf to ensure that where somebody has primarily healthcare needs, those needs are correctly assessed, and the assessments that should be undertaken are done so promptly and correctly, and that the individual's needs are correctly assessed. Secondly, if you disagree with the outcome of a decision support tool assessment, it's a little bit more straightforward because, well, it is and it isn't. Unfortunately, with every aspect of continuing healthcare, there's two sides to each, two sides of the coin. But in theory, it's more straightforward because there is a process that permits you to independently appeal an outcome you disagree with, and you can do so on the basis that the process followed was incorrect, or the evidential position does not correctly reflect. Was not correctly reflected in the assessment that was undertaken. So in effect, that the scores the individual was given aren't correct because the evidence shows that their needs are greater than what the assessment team concluded. Now, the appeals process is set out again within the national framework for the clinical commissioning groups to follow, but unfortunately can be interpreted differently by clinical commissioning group to clinical commissioning group. So depending on the area the patient is located, the process that's adopted may differ slightly. The base position should be that there is first a local resolution meeting, and if that does not result in matters being satisfied to the correct process from the family's perspective or the patient's perspective, then the option then is for a local level independent appeal hearing. Now, let's deal with the local resolution meeting first. From our perspective, it is a bit of a frustrating point because, in essence, very often it does not have the power to overturn the decision. So where we have highlighted the evidence clearly supports that somebody has primary healthcare needs and the decision support tool assessment that's been undertaken is in effect wrong, there is very little point sitting around a table to discuss why we're in disagreement, because we say it's backed by the evidence. I believe the process is envisaged for someone who is unsupported by an expert, who perhaps has no familiarity whatsoever with the continuing healthcare funding process, and gives the clinical commissioning group an opportunity to sit down with the individual and explain why the decision has been reached. Now, if it's the case that somebody doesn't have primary healthcare needs and the family have simply said, well, we want to appeal, that, I suppose, gives them an opportunity to be able to explain why the individual doesn't have primary healthcare needs, and perhaps cuts the appeal process dead at that stage, without the time and expense to everyone involved of going through the full appeals process. Where the individual is represented by an expert such as Compass Continuing Healthcare, significant work would have been undertaken to clarify that the evidence does support an individual has primarily a healthcare need, and we simply do not undertake frivolous appeals. We would only undertake one on the basis that the evidence supports the position the individual is entitled to the funding. Therefore, this meeting is somewhat of a lame duck, but a necessary step to be undertaken. We would ask that it be conducted by telephone or as a paper-based exercise in order to move swiftly through the appeals process. Moving on from the local resolution meeting, the local level independent appeal hearing should involve an independent chairperson and a representative from the social services, a local authority, and a clinical individual, none of whom have been involved thus far in the assessment of this individual. So they should, in theory, hear evidence from the patient or their representative as to why we disagree with the level of need that were concluded and what evidence supports us in that conclusion. The problem can be then the different interpretations by different clinical commissioning groups, and from our perspective, the question of how independent the chairperson is and how independent the representative nurse and the representative social worker are. Sometimes clinical commissioning groups can bring in completely out of area individuals, and therefore it's a lot more independent. Sometimes it can be very much an in-house exercise, and the independent chairperson is simply somebody employed within the clinical commissioning group who have not yet worked on the case. In those situations, we would suggest that perhaps there is slightly less independence than in the true envisaged meaning of the word. Now, Compass CHC employ a team of specialist advocates who solely deal in the area of continuing healthcare funding and have a vast experience of attending both assessments and local and NHS England appeal hearing meetings. So were you to instruct us at that stage, we would be able to provide an advocate to attend the hearing and to put forward the arguments in a logical, cogent manner, setting out exactly why an individual is entitled to the funding and why the initial decision support or assessment formed the incorrect conclusion. In the worst case scenario, that it's not accepted at local level within the appeal hearing that the individual is entitled to funding, you further have an opportunity to appeal to NHS England, which of course is the overriding body with responsibility for implementation of healthcare services, which includes continuing healthcare funding. And they will convene a truly independent appeal hearing with an independent chair and a completely out of area nurse and a representative from the local authority, such as a social worker. Clearly in those circumstances, the argument would be that it's a fully independent process which may not have been adopted to the same manner by the local stage within the clinical commissioning group. Again, Compass CHC employ advocates who have vast experience of attending such assessments with a great deal of success. We have an exceptionally high success rate where it has been necessary to attend NHS England appeal hearings. Finally, in the worst case scenario that you go through the whole process and you have taken part in the NHS England appeals hearing and the matter does still not conclude that there is entitlement to the funding, the final option is to take matters to the Health Ombudsman, which is the final recourse available. So, Compass Continuing Healthcare are, as I've stated before, experts exclusively in the area of continuing healthcare funding. If you have any queries or questions in relation to any aspect of continuing healthcare funding, we'd be more than happy to take the time to speak to you. We offer a free, no obligation, strictly confidential service where we'd be happy to go through matters as to how it applies to your particular relative and explain the options you have and how we may be able to assist. Our phone number is 0121 227 8940. Separately, we do have a website, www.continuing-healthcare.co.uk. There should be a wealth of information available which hopefully explains the process alongside video blogs such as this. And as I say, if you complete an assessment form or contact us by phone, we'll be more than happy to explain how we can help. Thank you.